Hi everyone, it's William. This is the Grand Duke Dmitri 1921 Diary series, and this is actually my third attempt to do this video. I keep having interruptions, so hopefully I'll make it this time. We are doing the second section of the long diary entry of the 15th of March / 2nd of April 1921. It was written on a Tuesday in Paris, and of course you know Dmitri's address there, so I will not repeat that. So I kind of abruptly decided while making the video last time to stop a little over midway and continue it later. So that's what this video is about. So a recap of yesterday's section, even before he had left, before he'd left on March 1st, left Copenhagen. Dmitri had already, a couple days before, heard from Prince Olga that there was good news out of Russia, that there was turmoil going on there, specifically anti-Bolshevik turmoil, and Dmitri was he was trying to not get his hopes up, because on the one hand, he knew what an optimist Olga tended to be and how much he liked to give people good news, and also because even in the press, people had in the past gotten very excited about the possibility that the Bolshevik regime would fall, and that had, of course, never panned out. So let's see, do I need any more explanation? So he's talking about that he heard that there were, especially, he says that when he reached Berlin, which is where he went upon leaving Copenhagen, he didn't go directly back to Paris, but upon reaching Berlin, he found out that the rumors were being confirmed and that there were uprisings, as he puts it, especially in Petrograd and Moscow, with the aim of overthrowing the Soviet regime. Okay, so now we start with the new text. A few days later, more definite information came through, according to which it turned out that the revolutionary movement began in Kronstadt and is centered there. The sailors, supported by the workers, have proclaimed an anti-Bolshevik revolution and entered into open and armed conflict with Moscow. Meanwhile, something of the same kind has apparently broken out in Petrograd, and it's even been reported that the capital is in the hands of the rebels, and a white flag is flying over the Winter Palace. I will just interject that by white flag, he does not mean a flag of surrender. Okay, back to Dmitri. No one knows why it's a white flag instead of the Russian national flag. I suppose we'll find out later that it was because the revolutionaries feared above all else to be taken for reactionaries. There were also uprisings in Moscow, but apparently they were on a smaller scale and thus were repressed very quickly. At the moment, the situation is quite uncertain. Apparently, the movement has already been completely quashed in Moscow, but in Petrograd, the Soviets, as of now, control only certain areas. Kronstadt remains independent of the other uprisings, and the use of military force against it has not accomplished anything. According to some reports, the Kronstadt batteries are shelling Petrograd and the Krasnaya Gorka batteries, and then he ends that with the sign of the cross, because obviously he's praying and he's hoping that the Bolshevik regime will finally fall. And by this time, by 1921, it had become not the Bolshevik regime any longer, but the Soviet regime, the Soviet Union. I don't know if they were using Union, but Soviet. It was no longer referred to as the Bolshevik state, although it was still the Bolsheviks who were running it, of course. All right, so yes, he's correct. There was this uprising in Moscow. It was relatively on a small scale, and it was put down fairly easily, or so I believe. And this is not my specialty. My PhD dissertation ends in 1917. And so this is not something I've looked into in depth, and you're always welcome to correct me or to offer constructive criticism. Okay, and there were also uprisings in Petrograd that were more serious, I gather, than the ones in Moscow, and Dmitri says that they're still ongoing. But this idea that the Soviets are not in control of Petrograd, that they only control certain areas, is, I believe, not correct. And this idea that there's a flag flying from the Winter Palace because it's in the hands of the anti-Bolshevik forces is also, I believe, incorrect. But Dmitri is going to be continuing to talk about this, especially when he gets to the day-to-day diary entries, and we will, with him, be able to watch it unfold. So in Kronstadt, in particular, that uprising lasted from the 1st of March to the 15th of March, and if that is on the old calendar, and Dmitri is writing this on the 15th of March on the old calendar, then there's still, it's pretty much over, but there's still a few days to go. But I'm really confused by the whole calendar situation, so I'm not exactly sure. But he's certainly talking in this diary entry as though it's an ongoing thing. And okay, so Kronstadt, as he rightly says, was the main event. And Kronstadt was this heavily fortified island/naval base that also had a walled city in the Gulf of Finland. So it was cut off from the mainland, from Petrograd, and at that time the Gulf of Finland was frozen. So it had been the center of revolutionary activity before. So there had been a Kronstadt uprising connected to the 1905 revolution, and there had been another Kronstadt uprising in 1917 against the Tsarist state. And so the Russian Navy in particular, and this was a naval base. So Dmitri rightly says that it's not just the sailors, but it's the sailors supported by the workers and some of the residents of the city in Kronstadt. The Russian Navy had always had a radical element. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the uprising, the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, which was, if I'm correct, the first action in the 1905 revolution. So, I'm not sure quite why that is, except that I've heard it said that, sailors travel. Soldiers don't necessarily travel, but sailors travel. They see other parts of the world. And if they don't like the way things are in their own country, then they have something to compare it to. So maybe that is the case. If you want to learn, I'll put a little plug in for myself. If you want to learn a lot of interesting things about the pre-revolutionary Russian Navy, I translated this book, which is the Memoirs of a Russian Admiral, Semyon Semyonich Fabritsky, Of Bygone Days, The Memoirs of an Aide-de-Camp to the Emperor Nicholas II. And so there's a lot in it that will please Romanov aficionados, since Fabritsky was a Flegel adjutant to Nicholas II and seemingly one of his favorite Flegel adjutants. But there's also a great deal in it about Fabritsky's naval career before he ever became a Flegel adjutant. And so you learn a lot, and highly critical account of the Russian Navy, well worth reading. All right, so let's talk about Kronstadt. What did the sailors want? What did the people who were rising up in Moscow and Petrograd want, for that matter? Well, they weren't so happy with what they had. So a lot of these people had initially been participants in and very enthusiastic about the revolution to overturn the Tsarist state. And then that was followed by the Civil War, and the revolution was the Bolshevik revolution. The Bolshevik powers that be were fighting for their survival, and so everybody was preoccupied with that. But by 1921, things had settled down. You had the Soviet Union instead of just the Bolsheviks. You had negotiations with other countries for formal recognition of the Soviet state and for trade agreements. And so people suddenly realized, oh, this is what we're stuck with, like it or not. This is our government. And a lot of people found out that they didn't like it. They didn't like the repression. They didn't like the lack of civil rights that they thought were going to come in a very broad sense, more than they'd had under the Tsars. They were going to come under the Bolsheviks, and instead they found out it was actually less. They had less rights. And they didn't like the food situation and the fact that there were also uprisings in the countryside among the peasants. They didn't like that the government could simply take what they wanted of their crops and leave them with sort of barely enough to feed themselves. And there was food crisis in the urban areas, in the cities as well, and the workers weren't happy. And so everything kind of, even though things had settled down, there was this sudden, there was sort of this buyer's remorse that created these various armed uprisings, protests, strikes, all of these things, and they weren't well coordinated enough to really topple the government. But the most important, I think you could say the most famous, the most gripping, in my opinion, was the Kronstadt Uprising that started, it's dated to the 1st of March. So what did the sailors want? Well, the sailors did not want a return to Tsarism, absolutely not. And they said they didn't even want a return to the liberal provisional government, but they did not want the level of centralized power that the Soviet authorities had gained. They wanted power to be distributed among the local Soviets and the soldier Soviets and the worker Soviets, and not just have one centralized Soviet that ran everything. They wanted, a lot of them, I'm told, were anarchists, not Bolsheviks, and they wanted for there to be room within the state for other political points of view, for anarchist and socialist revolutionary and, other sort of revolutionary minded, not conservative, but nonetheless offering some kind of option other than Bolshevism and some kind of interplay between ideas. They wanted that, and they realized they didn't have that anymore. So they were in a situation where they could be attacked at any time by soldiers because of the fact that the island was iced in, and infantry could go over the ice and try to reach them. So they needed to hold out long enough for the ice to melt. And then they would be much more able to defend themselves. So that was the hope. So let's go to what Dmitri himself tells us about this. He is telling us that they have entered into open and armed conflict with Moscow. So why does he say that? I mean, geographically speaking, Kronstadt is not near Moscow. It's part of St. Petersburg, basically. But apparently the authorities and the Soviets in Petrograd were more thinking that they could reach some kind of agreement, some kind of peaceful agreement, and make some concessions to the rebels in Kronstadt, whereas Moscow, they absolutely decided they wanted to deal with this in the harshest possible way. So that is why Dmitri quite rightly points to Moscow as the real the conflict really being between Moscow and Kronstadt. Okay, and then he talks about in this idea of the white flag that's appeared, so he says, on the Winter Palace. And it's not the Bolshevik, it's not the red communist flag, it's not the Russian national flag. I'm surprised he used that word national. I would have thought that he would have thought of Russia less as a nation than as an empire, and he doesn't say the Russian imperial flag, but the Russian national flag. I'm not sure what that even would have been, unless it was just the tricolors without the double-headed eagle. But the white flag, why? And he, again, I don't know who he's talking to exactly, or whether he's figuring these things out for himself or from the newspapers, but again, he's quite right in pointing out that whether or not this white flag over the Winter Palace actually even existed, that the primary, sort of primordial, visceral fear of the rebels is that they will be lumped together with the White Russian movement, with the White Russian emigres, with counter-revolutionary forces, or with reactionaries. They absolutely want to avoid that at all costs. They want it known that they are revolutionaries who are in favor of an anarchist state or a communist state, or an agrarian peasant-run state, but they are absolutely not counter-revolutionary. So that is something that Dmitri will talk about more, and that we'll talk about more. But so far, so good, with how he's assessing things. Now, he says that Kronstadt remains independent of the other uprisings. And again, that is true. But that was problematic for the rebels in Kronstadt because they did not want it to be independent. They knew that their only possibility of prevailing or even just getting concessions and a peaceful conclusion was for this movement to spread. And so that was a hope of theirs, but some of the uprisings actually preceded Kronstadt and started as early as around the middle of February, I believe. And so they weren't the first, but they were hoping that their particular, they issued a list of concessions that they wanted, not at all radical, if Moscow hadn't dug in its heels. They might have been able to come to some agreement that would have been a better situation for everybody. But yeah, so the spread that they were hoping for just didn't happen. So let's see. Yes, this whole idea about the Kronstadt batteries shelling Petrograd and shelling the Krasnaya Gorka batteries. Well, I haven't heard about that. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It could be wrong news that Dmitri got, or could just be something that I didn't know about. Certainly, they were heavily armed on Kronstadt. There were several forts. As I say, the whole island was fortified, and certainly they had batteries and they had resources like that. But I haven't specifically heard about that. I'll have to look into this more deeply. And finally, just a last word about the attitude in Moscow. I think in Moscow, after these other little uprisings, they felt very threatened. They may have seemed to be quite stable by that point, but, they probably felt like it could all fall apart. And so they decided to go in this direction of being as harsh as they possibly could. And I wonder, probably not, but I wonder if one of the things that entered into their heads was the fact that they had a Tsar in waiting, so to speak, very nearby, not at all far away in Copenhagen at that time, and then in Berlin, and then a little further away by the 15th of March in Paris. But they would have known, they had intelligence agents, they would have known that there was Dmitri, And they would have known that there was also Kirill, who was himself a naval officer before he left Russia. And, they would have known that these men could, if they faltered, could become rallying points and could even, enter the country. So I will leave it with that. I hope you will come back. This is really fascinating stuff, in my opinion. I remember watching a fascinating documentary about Kronstadt, and I wish I could find that specific one because it was so good. And yeah, I'll just say in closing too, there was another person, as I learned from this book, who was as watching all of this as anxiously as Dmitri, and he had a connection to Dmitri, although I don't think the two of them ever met. And this was the leader of the socialist revolutionaries, who were an agrarian rather than proletarian revolutionary group. And he was so anti-Bolshevik that he had fought against the Red troops in the Russian Civil War and fought alongside the Tsarist troops. And then he got out and went to Paris, and his connection with Dmitri was that he was the ringleader of the little group that and the mastermind of the little group that assassinated Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, Dmitri's uncle. So I don't think Dmitri ever ran into him in Paris. Other people like Kerensky, Alexander Kerensky, who had been the head of the provisional government did run into Savinkov in Paris, but if Dmitri ever did, I don't know about it. But you have both of these men sitting back and watching the reports come in with great hope that this will finally be it, that either Dmitri will be able to enter Russia as the new Tsar, or Savinkov would be able to enter Russia as the head of the socialist revolutionary parties and it didn't work out for either of them, but so it goes. So I hope to see you next time. Bye.